Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start. Can I introduce myself to those of you who don't know me? My name is Donald Cryan, and I'm the chairman of the Inner Temple History Society. This is the Michaelmas term event of the History Society. It's taking a different format from usual because normally we have a more or less conventional lecture. But this time we're actually having a seminar, and you'll see the format that it's going to take in due course. It arises out of the fact that about a year ago now, a group of benchers came together and collected sufficient money to buy a very interesting copy of Paradise Lost. And it was annotated in a way which was thought to be interesting and relevant to the inn. Today, we're going to try and answer some of the questions about what are the connections of this particular work with the inn, what the Milton scholars make of this particular edition, and we have the great benefit in the chair of this discussion of our own Master of the Revels, Master Tom Kinninmont, who is himself a Doctor of English Literature, but we have, in addition, two experts on Milton. And my goodness, they're about as important and relevant as you could get in terms of expertise. The first is Professor Joe Moshenka. Now, I see that he's lost his S. I'm reminded that when the Middle Temple, not us, was holding a lecture on the Magna Carta, it was a Magna Carta with an ER. And so these things do happen, and I hope can be forgiven. Professor Moshenka is the Professor of English Literature at Oxford, having studied at Yale and at Cambridge. He's spoken and written extensively about John Milton, and most recently, in 2021, published Making Darkness Light for the Lives and Times of John Milton. With him is Dr. William Poole. Since 2004, he's been at New College and a tutorial fellow in English. He's also a senior tutor and fellow librarian there, and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. He also has published on Milton, and his two most recent books on Milton are Milton and The Making of Paradise Lost, which is published by the Harvard Press, and John Milton's manuscript writings published by in the Oxford Milton series. So as I promised, we could hardly have two more learned and well-informed scholars on Milton to help us to see what the value of this particular work is. I will say no more because there's a lot to be said, and hand over to Master Kinninmont, Tom Kinninmont, to chair the proceedings.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Don. Let me introduce you to the man who's responsible for us being here tonight. His name is Jacob Thompson, and he was the publisher of the first illustrated edition of Paradise Lost, which is a copy of which the inn has recently acquired. There had been three previous editions, and they had sold, apparently, Will tells me, reasonably well. But it would appear that Thompson was a real promoter, and he turned the book into the Harry Potter of its time. He claimed to have made more money from publishing Paradise Lost than any other publication he ever had. And there were successive editions. Even after he died, his son kept bringing out illustrated editions. He was so proud of it that is the book in his hand. he had his portrait painted with the book because he was so happy with its success. Milton had, he was a local lad. He was born in Bread Street, about 50 minutes walk from here. But he had various connections with this end. He was, he had a kind of mutual admiration set up with a chap called John Selden. And in fact, Don is the president of the Selden Society, which exists to research the history of the law, I guess, in this country. But more strongly than that, Milton's younger brother, Christopher, dropped out of Cambridge without his degree, came down and was admitted to the Inner Temple, became a barrister and eventually a judge. Not that he and John were on good terms, because he became a Catholic, which was highly unacceptable to John, and also he was a royalist, which at a time when the king was getting his head chopped off. Anyway, more of that later. Who was Milton, and why is he so important? Will.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll start off, and Joe can chip in after I do something rather simple, which is that I'm going to assume that you don't really know who this person is, and you would like me to tell you a little bit about his biography and a thumbnail sketch, and then we will get closer into the poetry later on and why it matters. Milton is born in 1608. He's a Londoner. His father is a scrivener, which is basically a kind of sort of paralegal kind in the period, who are mainly employed to write up documents, but also tend to function as money lenders. So Milton's dad specialises in lending out money at high interest, and he actually settles some of his early business on his son. So Milton is actually quite well heeled for a lot of his life to do with his dad's shrewd business manoeuvres around the legal industry in London. In his spare time, his dad is a musician. He's a very fine composer. He wrote some wonderful violin music which has been recorded, and he's part of a group of composers around St. Paul's. It's probably not a coincidence that Milton himself then goes to St. Paul's school and will have been well acquainted with the music that was going on in St. Paul's Cathedral, and quite a lot of his writing is full of consciousness of music, of musical form. And I think this comes from a very kind of London musical, pretty well-heeled background. His dad had been kicked out as a young man by his dad, who was the warden of Shotover Park in Oxfordshire, because Milton Senior had been found reading the Bible in English. And Milton Double Senior, as it were, was a Roman Catholic, had kicked out his son. He had probably become a choir boy in Oxford and eventually moved to London, where he made his fortune. And he was determined that his son wasn't going to have the rocky ride that he'd had. And so he basically gives his son a very good education. He hires for him private tutors in modern languages, which is not a common thing at all at this time. So much so that by the time Milton was in his teens, he was probably fluent in Italian, which is extremely rare. One of his best friends was from a famous Protestant Italian family in London, where they have their own church and an Italian liturgy. And later in life, when Milton got to Italy, the Italians were astounded that this man could both speak and write, and indeed write poetry in both Italian and especially in Latin. And they didn't really believe that anyone north of the Alps could do this. Milton goes on to Cambridge. He had quite a good time there, really, although he pretended he didn't afterwards. And I might get back to that a little bit about some of the accusations that were made against him. But he was a very scholarly character and affected to be rather disgusted at his fellow students who went to plays and went to the pub and all the rest of it. But anyway, after that, the politics of the land was shifting in a direction that Milton and his family didn't really approve of. And Milton, rather than going into the church, which is what you would expect of a clever young graduate at this point, decides that he will go into a period of private scholarship. and he spends most of the 1630s sitting around reading books, an absolutely astonishing quantity of books. I'm the guy who edited his commonplace book that was his reading record in this period, and I did some arithmetic about how much this guy was reading every day. And he was reading 6-volume histories of what was going on in France in Latin, crunching at a rate of pages that would be just unthinkable these days. He must have been spending a minimum of 12 hours hard reading a day at quite high speed in a whole array of modern languages as well as ancient languages. After he does this, he decides he'll go on a tour to the continent, and Daddy packs him off with some money and a servant, and they have a nice old jaunt through France and particularly into Italy. He thinks about going on to Greece, but thinks it's a bit dangerous and comes home. This is at the period when the English Civil War is just brewing. And when Milton comes back, something rather surprising happens, which is that he starts writing not poetry, which is what we thought he was going to be doing. That's what he has been telling us up till now he wants to do, and he has done quite a bit. We'll talk a bit about this in due course. But that he starts writing pamphlets. He starts writing increasingly aggressive pamphlets against many of the institutions of the state. He is very much on the parliamentarian side. He starts off saying, I want to get rid of bishops. He writes a whole bunch of pamphlets about how we should get rid of bishops. This is unusual behaviour for a moneyed Cambridge graduate at this time. It's not unthinkable, but it's unusual. He is to be anachronistic, moving to the left. But he then starts publishing a whole bunch of other works which are increasingly troubling to sort of the right-thinking orthodox. He gets married on rather suddenly. He probably shouldn't have. It didn't go very well. And he immediately starts writing books about how you should be able to divorce your other half if you don't like them very much. And he was greeted with howls of heresy. And so Milton did what he always did in this situation, is that he published it again with even more. And his sense that one must always sit forward into the fight is part of his ethics. He believes that virtue is only virtue in struggle. And he therefore increasingly moves into other areas. He writes a pamphlet on how all education needs to be reformed in a manner that would actually necessitate closing Oxford and Cambridge. He starts writing about other kinds of liberty. And gradually, as the situation gets worse and worse, Milton starts moving into more strongly political territory. And in 1649, when they execute the king, Milton opens his commonplace book, finds pages of material about why you should be able to execute a tyrant, which he has got from his reading, and he starts publishing books. The government starts looking at him and saying, who is this amazing pen? Can we not hire this man? And so the government finds him a job, the Civil War government, not quite the Cromwellian government yet, but the Republic finds him a job as the Secretary for Foreign Tongues, which is basically the man tasked with translating all of England's diplomatic correspondence into effectively Latin. So he becomes the mouthpiece and the stylist for the English Republic to the continent. And what the continent knew about English foreign policy came through the pen of John Milton. All the while, though, he is meditating writing. He has realised that he has gone far into politics, far into prose. He goes even further into prose. The government start paying him to write large Latin defences of what the English have done. A good way of thinking about the English government at the moment is that they are like the Taliban. They have done something that puts them absolutely outside the moral and legal frameworks of most of their contemporaries. And Milton is charged with explaining why he thinks this is. And he does this an awful lot by retreating to what he thinks of as classic Roman Republican arguments about power and authority and tyranny. But all the while he's pumping out these Latin defences, he knows that he has made a promise in youth, and I'll come back to that a bit later in our talk, which is that he will write the great epic of the English people, which was quite a boast. Unfortunately, after he made this boast, he goes blind, and I'm sure this is something Joe will mention as well. By 1652, he can no longer see, and he's still a major civil servant, and so we have to think of a man who is the major hired pen in the English government for all international correspondence, who has not been able to see since 1652. I mean, it's a quite remarkable story that he then writes this epic in the dark. He in fact doesn't write it at all. He dictates it. It is an epic poem which has gone back to the primal condition of literature that he believed Homer himself had composed in, which is blind and using the mouth. And Milton dictates this epic, this astonishingly constructed poem. Samuel Johnson said it is the most perfectly designed creation of all literature. He doesn't say it's the best. He says Homer is number one. But in design, Milton is number two. And this is the most astonishingly patterned piece of English literature written entirely by a blind man. And this he publishes in total political disgrace. 1660, obviously the Restoration. 1667, Milton is blind, penniless, disgraced. All his property is burnt down. He's being messed around by his family, by everyone at home. He is a man really on the back foot. And then he drops it. 1667, Paradise Lost, the greatest work of English literature ever written. And it's against the backdrop of that astonishing life of the scholar, turned government official, turned pariah, that this work comes out. I'll pause there for a bit because you may want, that's in some senses a quite traditional spin.
Well,
you may want to chip in.
let me ask you a couple of questions arising out of that. This aspect of his father being a moneylender and the marriage that didn't work, are those two elements linked?
Yes, they seem to be linked in that Milton inherits certain debts owed to his father, and rides into Oxfordshire, to a village near Oxford, which is now a sort of almost a suburb of Oxford, to collect the debt, and instead comes back married to the debtor's 15-year-old daughter. And no one quite knows what the relationship is between the money owed and the marriage. But as Will said, it's an infamous disaster. So yes, I think those are connected, and I suppose that's a useful. You know, I don't want to add anything to Will's exemplary outlining of the major events of Milton's life. I guess one reason to focus on the failed marriage and what comes out of that, I think, if you read the records, Milton, as Will said, writes this book Justifying Divorce, which is very much his side of the story. I think when you look at the evidence, one thing you strongly come away with is what an absolute nightmare being married to John Milton would have been.
A lot of poets wrote poetry about Milton, people at Dryden and Marvell, but I came across a poem by Lord Byron, which refers to him being an odd spouse.
It's an understatement. Yeah.
The first Mrs. Milton left his house.
Yeah. So they're then right. So they become estranged, and she goes back to Oxfordshire, and there's this weird sort of parallel between what's happening in the nation at large and what's happening in the Milton household, because of course Oxford, where she's from, is the centre of the royalist court, having left London. So they are actually divided by the battle lines of the Civil War for several years, so while they are, as it were, at civil war with one another within the Milton household. I guess the thing that is worth saying when we think about Milton the man, which was where we started, the thing that sort of floats, maybe the kind of elephant in the room of some of those facts and things that we've just heard about, is that he's not an easy man to like, I think, when you first read him and first learn about him. And you might think that's a silly thing to say, why should we care? Are we in the business of trying to decide who from the past was nice and who wasn't, who was good and who was bad? I don't think we are, but the really complicated thing about Milton, part of what I think has always fascinated me about him, is that it's very, very difficult to set that question aside, not only because he's so emphatically present in his writings in a way that's utterly different to Shakespeare, with whom he's always paired and contrasted. The fascinating thing about Shakespeare is he disappears into his works. It's amazing that for someone who wrote so much, it's impossible to say Shakespeare thought X about Y. We really don't know that with Shakespeare. Yeah. It's always voiced. With Milton, it almost seems like the opposite is the problem. He's telling us what he thinks constantly. And also, the really, I think, it's sort of fascinating, but I think at first disconcerting, and I think I'll try and come back later and to qualify some of these things that I'm saying, but it's even more complicated with Milton, because you have a sense, certainly if you've tried to read Paradise Lost, or if you have read it, you might sense something of what I'm saying. There's a feeling when you read it that the sort of difficulty of the man actually contributes to the greatness of the work. It's not that you can put it aside, it's that something about the kind of, the things that would have made him a nightmare as a husband, the megalomania, the kind of total single-minded kind of devotion to his reading, to his own personal development. All those things are actually part of what makes the verse amazing, makes it powerful, and that actually is there in the grandeur and the magnificence of what he writes. So it's not easy to separate those things. It's a bit of a scandalous sort of analogy, but it's a bit like when you first see Caravaggio paintings, and then you learn that he stabbed a guy to death in a knife fight, and you look at the paintings, you think, yeah, I can see that actually. It doesn't seem extraneous. There's something about the sort of violence of the way of seeing the world, of the kind of clarity of the representation in Caravaggio, which you feel there's something in this guy that means I'm not surprised he's a murderer. Milton was not a murderer. Let me just quickly qualify that. But that's what makes him fascinating. Not because we can decide, oh, he was a nasty piece of work, but because in engaging with the writing, we can't not wrestle with the question, who was this guy? And that makes him such an interesting test case for how we relate to the past, for what we want great writers to be like or not to be like. All those kind of questions become really interesting to me.
I mean, he was, of course, very anti-Catholic, which
Indeed.
would not be unusual in those days, but
No.
he spent a lot of time in Italy.
Yeah.
He met Galileo in Italy. I mean,
Almost
he obviously
certainly.
sought him out, and
Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that he considered staying in Italy.
That I don't know, but certainly I'm not sure. But that's possible. As Will said, he claimed later that he was going to go to Greece, and then heard that the civil war had broken out and rushed back. The timeline actually doesn't work. I don't think really. It's a retrospective bit of neatening up. But you're right. It's a fascinating thing. So you're right that anti-Catholicism isn't unusual. What's actually unusual is the flip side. Is that so famously in his work Areopagitica, written against press censorship or licensing, he lays out this incredibly tolerant vision of the opinions that should be allowed into a society, that should be part of the groups who should be allowed to express themselves. That's the unusual bit. But then he says, but not Catholics. they're beyond the pale, because effectively he sees Roman Catholics have committed what is for him, in some sense, I think, because of his, in a way, it's the sort of flip side of his own deep commitment to working out one's individual view of things. In his view, what Roman Catholics had done was committed the sort of ultimate sin, which is outsourcing their judgment to a centralised authority. So in allowing an individual Catholic to express his or her opinion, in his view, you are not actually allowing them to express their own opinion, but rather the opinion of the authority to which they have ceded that opinion. Therefore, for him, that has no viable place in the public sphere. So it's a complicated form of anti-Catholicism that tells you something interesting about what is in some ways, let's say, a kind of staggeringly open and sort of tolerant view for his time.
Now, what about his relationship with London, which is a topic?
Yes. Well, you mentioned. Sorry, I'll just say some. Yes. Briefly on the Italy trip. I that's one thing I also was always fascinated by with his life, is that he has this incredible excursion, which, as you say, into the belly of the beast. Right. He spends a lot of time with Catholics, for someone who claimed to hate them so much, and maintained correspondence with many of the men he met. After returning, he read poetry at learned societies, academies in Florence. Probably met Galileo, as he said, and the first chance I had to do some fun thinking about this side of Milton in 2017, I got to do a Radio 4 documentary about him, where we went to Italy and sort of followed in his footsteps and went to some really fun places. That was, I went to Galileo's villa and went to a monastery outside Florence called Vallombrosa, which is mentioned in Paradise Lost, and became a sort of pilgrimage site. So people like, in fact, Nietzsche went there, partly because he was interested in Milton, lots of English tourists as well. It became a sort of tourist site, even though there is no evidence that Milton went. He just liked he may have just liked the name. So I love this idea of taking this great English poet into Italy, especially, that's not where you'd expect to find him, surrounded by Italian Renaissance people and art and music and so on. He also wrote poems to a great singer in Rome, so all these surprising things. But when I literally came back to England, and when I then was writing my book about Milton, I began to get really interested in the flip side, in what was very close to home. And really to think of him as a London writer, because that's not how I first encountered him. I think if you ask the sort of general reader to think about great London writers, you get Dickens probably first, and Blake, and maybe and Milton wouldn't really. Because we associate him with, poems that are about the Garden of Eden. He has a mind that takes you elsewhere, a mind that seems to flee the here and now in the pursuit of something loftier and more magnificent. And yet he lived large parts, he was raised in London, as Will said. And so one thing I did when I was writing my book was just came to London and walked around and between lots of the places that he'd lived. Not because I thought I was going to discover anything really about him. Obviously part of what you experience if you walk around London and think about the 17th century is how much is gone. What you're really experiencing is the waves of history, the Great Fire, the Blitz. What you're really experiencing is a city that's been wiped away and reconstructed repeatedly. And if you go to Bread Street, where he was born, it's always a parody of kind of corporate blankness. There is a little John Milton lane with a plaque for him above a sort of fire hydrant, but it's really not. There's a branch of Lobster and Burger or whatever that restaurant's called. It's not very Miltonic at all. So I didn't feel like it was a pilgrimage in that sense, but I was really interested partly to think about the spaces. There were certain things that I was interested in that were to do with his life. So, for example, I was reading the statutes of St Paul's School where he studied, and one thing I noticed in them was that the St Paul's boys had a really long lunch break. Every day they had classes until I think 11, and they didn't resume until 1:30 or 2, something like that. And this is partly because they didn't, because the boys were not boarding there, or at least many of them weren't. So Milton would go home for lunch every day. Well, I thought, well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? That's a different side of the school day. I've done a lot of reading and thinking about Renaissance education and the kind of learning he would have been, and we might talk more about him as both a student and a teacher, because that's such a key part of his life. But I began to, but he goes home every day. That's quite interesting. So I thought, well, what does he see? What does he see on his walk home? And I walked from St Paul's down Cheapside to Bread Street, and then read as much as I could about those spaces. And this is a boy who's leaving his St Paul's schoolroom and experiencing this very intense version of a sort of, that's the school where a kind of English humanist educational program was most sort of potently formulated. So he's getting this real sort of kind of cutting edge humanist education. But then he walks down London's biggest and busiest commercial thoroughfare back to his house. And back every day. And so certain things like that were really interesting to actually think about the spaces that he moved through, and then certain kind of echoes across his life that he might even, I don't know if he was even aware of these things, but I was very struck that he, in a kind of circular thing, towards the end of his life, one of the places he lives where he's probably finishing, maybe where he finishes Paradise Lost, is a house just by Bunhill Fields, which is now, it's a fascinating cemetery. If you haven't been there, it's where Blake is buried, and Bunyan and Defoe, and a really kind of interesting, there's many great English nonconformist writers buried there. Bunhill Fields was begun as a cemetery in the late 17th century, and the hill is actually mostly made out of bones that were removed from the charnel houses in St Paul's churchyard and brought down and dumped on that site. So he ends his life living in this quite macabre space, but also one that weirdly picks up on something that he, it's kind of, something like 50 or 70 cartloads of bones that are brought down from St Paul's to make that. Again, I'm not suggesting Milton knew about any of that, but it was just really interesting to experience London as a space with all these historical layers to it that might, and something we might come back to when we think about the book, about the volume, is that I think that's the version of history that really interests me. It's not, not necessarily the one where you're looking and saying this is the thing, this is the source, this is the truth, but it's the sort of many layers at once of it, where you feel like you're doing a sort of mental archaeology in order to keep lots of times and places in your head at once.
Well, Milton was obviously a very successful polemicist and a successful civil servant, I suppose, in the Protectorate. But he wanted to be known as a poet. And the mature Milton went out of his way to do that. He published, collected poems and, all the rest of it before he got into Paradise Lost. Now, I think you wanted to pick up on the poetry.
Sure. I'll tell you a little bit about his the history of his poetry writing. But I love the idea of Milton's lunch break, Joe. I'm not going to forget about that. It's really interesting. Joe's absolutely right to say that Milton is the first English writer who talks about himself a lot. And it is dramatic, the change. If you look at 16th century or early 17th century writers, very few of them have any kind of space in which they will talk about their writing lives. They might talk about their legal lives or their religious lives or something like that. But the idea of the poet finding a space to tell you about how poetical they are, a slightly romantic notion, just doesn't exist, which is why we know almost nothing about about what Shakespeare thought who he was as a writer. With Milton, the change is sudden. There is something which we can almost call egotism going on in just how much he wants to tell us about his vocation. It's a very complicated subject because with him it is bound up with strong religious convictions and frankly a sense that he is destined to be a great poet. And he tries to structure a lot of his life around what it might mean to be a great poet. What you do in this age if you want to be a great person is that you find books about other great people who lived hopefully in classical antiquity and you read up what they did and you say, well, I better be a bit like that as well. And it's interesting watching some of the early writing that Milton does is that you can read the poetry, but you can see behind the poetry that he's also actually trying to construct himself as a poet. And that is why I think that Milton is probably the origins of what we might think of as romanticism and romantic poetry, which is a shame because I hate romantic poetry. But nonetheless, I think that Milton's strong sense of the egotistical purpose of the writer and the way in which they have to hang on to the idea of vocation it's something that becomes very strong with Milton, who will digress to tell you about himself whenever he can. And I'll tell you about one of those in a moment. When he was very young at university, we know that he was known as the Lady of Christs. And that was probably because, as you saw from the picture behind that one of the young Milton, is that he does look very kind of, there we go, he's a delicate boy. And they called him the Lady of Christ, so they thought. And this was for a long time thought was referencing the fact that he looked a bit girly. Until someone pointed out that in the ancient biographies of Virgil was known as Parthenias, the virgin, the lady. And that there may have been a sense in which Milton's early nickname was actually part of his poetic vocation. This can be pushed a little bit further. Milton is, and I can't stress this enough because it's something which is unusual for us today. Milton is a bilingual poet, at least a bilingual poet. He actually writes in 4 or 5 languages. But his 2 main languages of poetry are Latin and English. And he is writing consistently in these languages right up until the point where he goes for the English epic. And he decides that English will be the master language of his epic. But an awful lot of his early poetry and his early reputation would have been made, particularly internationally with his Italian friends, on his Latin writing. And his Latin writing shows a strong tendency towards celibacy and not drinking. And he keeps on going on in his poetry about how the true poet must themselves be a true poem, to quote one of his famous pieces of prose. The poet must be a poem themselves. And that particularly in his early life, Milton cultivated around himself a mystique of chastity and sobriety because he thought that that's what a good classical poet did if they were going to work out as a poet. Now, one of the good reasons why I know about this, I said I'd tell you an anecdote about pamphlets, is that when he comes back, and as I said, he started attacking bishops and saying that the different words in the New Testament actually mean the same thing. Or rather don't mean the same thing. They're different offices. An episkopos and a presbyteros are different kind of people, and that's the kind of things that people killed one another for in the early 1640s. Someone attacks Milton's pamphlet and says, we don't really know, I've worked out who wrote this. It's a man who was at Cambridge. We all remember him. He was called John Milton. He was a ghastly little chap. Who hung around with women folks and went to plays. And we'll talk about the plays in a little while now, because that's probably true, and actually is a very important insight, because he has a strongly dramatic imagination. And Milton wasn't going to take this lying down, and he wrote a response in which he absolutely clobbered this person. And he said, I'm outraged at how you treat me. I was at Cambridge, I worked very hard, I was much better than everyone else, and I did not go to plays, or if I did, it was only to laugh at other people who went to plays. Which you can see how unconvincing it is. And then he loudly declares that he did not go there with womenfolk, nor did he hang around with womenfolk because he was a virgin and proud of it, because he believed that God had set him aside to write the nation's epic. He said he will write something that the nation will not willingly let die. This is an astonishing intervention in a pamphlet about effectively Greek words in the New Testament to do with different kinds of priests. And as they did at the time, attacks get very personal. He's hit by someone saying, you were a badly behaved student. He says, no, I wasn't a badly behaved student. And while we're at it, I'm going to write the national epic. You know, this is sort of an overcompensation, as it were, but it shows you very strongly how difficult he is. I mean, as Joe was saying, that for me is a prime example of, I think that the guy writing against him must have thought, wow, this is a genuinely peculiar man. I just said that he went to the theatre, and now he's saying he's going to write the national epic. So he then goes to Italy, and Joe's talked nicely about what he finds there. Part of the embarrassment for him is that these Roman Catholics, with their church that apparently tells them what to think, and Milton I think he probably did see Galileo, though how close the visit was we don't know. Milton does write about it afterwards, strongly in the context of the Inquisition and how the Inquisition have banged up this man for expressing views that the church doesn't hold. And this is a very strongly Protestant thing. We like to say in the Protestant countries that we possess the libertas philosophandi, the liberty to philosophize, and it's in these benighted Roman Catholic countries that academics don't have this liberty. It's a strong marker of English academic freedom at the time to say that this is the kind of thing that the Romans do. But the problem is that they do something else, is that they have literary academies that Joe mentioned, is that they have salons where learned people get together in the afternoon and they say, I'm going to read out some poetry I'm working on at the moment and you can give me some feedback. And Milton looks to the grim north and he thinks, we don't have anything like that. And he is in a position where he kind of finds that they are culturally so much more advanced than what he thinks he can find back at home. And that paradox of an oppressive church but a culturally advanced civilization, he thinks, is part of what I think drives him to think that he's going to have to be the northern solution to this. And he's going to have to drive this himself. And when he goes back home, one of the first things he does is that he sets up as a private school teacher. He writes his own curriculum, which is terrifying, 10-year-old boys learning Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac in odd moments on the weekend. He has this great throwaway phrase, like modern languages may be cultivated at some odd moment of the week. And he puts these children from the age of sort of 6 to 12 through basically the entire BA and MA course of an early modern university. And he did. We know from his nephews that he did. And these sort of poor, wrecked boys in their adulthood showed that Milton really was literally bashing this kind of stuff into these people. But all the while, he is writing poetry. And finally, in 1645, after he spent some years writing all these pamphlets against bishops and for divorce and for the freedom of the press, and rendering himself more and more odious to the right-thinking centre, as it were, is that he thinks, I have to reconnect with my destiny. And so he publishes his poems that he'd written up to that date in 1645 in a volume that tries very, very hard to say, let's not mention the war, folks. Let's not mention too much prose. There are some tendrils in it that it is actually a Civil War volume, but they are slight. And his publisher, and we'll come back to publishers later, but they're very important, tries to package this guy as a kind of Spencer revived, the great poet of the late 16th century. He's an English pastoralist who has tapped into the right vein of Elizabethan poetry. Let's not mention the divorce pamphlets, let's not mention the anti-bishop pamphlets. So there are kind of two Miltons struggling with one another here, and they come out in the poetry there. There's a very political Milton. He wrote a poem in memory of a friend of his who died in a shipwreck. And when he comes to republish it, this had happened in 1637, the poem, and when it's first published, it's a lovely long English elegy that many of you will have read or had to read in school called Lycidas. And when he republishes it in 1645, he adds a line at the top saying, this poem, by occasion foretells the ruin of our corrupted clergy then at their height. Now, he could not have known in 1637 that the English war was going to come along in 3 years' time and sweep away the clergy. But in the headnote to this poem, he then claims retrospectively for himself prophetic authority over the English situation. When I was writing this poetry, I was prophesying the future of the state and the downfall of the Laudian church, which is an astonishing way of pimping an early poem that was really just a poem on a friend of his who died in a shipwreck. So spinning forwards, before I hand on a little bit, we get to Paradise Lost, which, as I say, is a poem which was written really in the dark. Is that, unbeknownst to Milton, one of his eyes starts going, and then he realises it's going, and then it goes totally, and the other one goes, and by early 1652, they've both gone. But he's already made his boast that he's going to write this poem. And we'll talk a little bit under drama about how he had set about writing this great epic. But by the time it appears, it's first published in 1667 in the aftermath of a London ruined by fire and plague. And out comes an epic that is an epic to end all epics. It starts with the fall starts after the fall of Satan, the rebellious angels in hell. And it gradually moves through book by book, through the entire divine story. It spins up to heaven, where God and his Son have this theological discussion about what they're going to do about all these naughty angels. And then it goes to Eden, where we meet Adam and Eve. And then we have a nested creation epic in which Raphael, the Archangel Raphael, tells a battle poem of the war in heaven. The first epic in creation, as it was, Raphael giving us a battle epic, like one of Homer's epics. And then there is another epic in which Raphael talks about the creation of the universe to Adam and Eden. And then we get the tragic books of the fall, in which Adam and Eve fall. Then Adam and Eve repent, and then the epic ends with these two long prophetic books in which Adam is given a vision by the Archangel Michael, of the future to come, and of the final conflagration when Christ will return and all will be in all. In other words, he's writing an epic that, from the point of view of a 17th century Christian, embraces the entirety of sacred time. No one had done this before. There were plenty of epics about creation, there were plenty of epics about fall, usually actually in dramatic form, though. The creation ones are epics, but the fall ones are dramas. And Milton just sticks it all together into this epic, which nonetheless, almost every single line is a dense set of allusions to previous literature. There's a lot of Bible there, of course, but another way of thinking about the achievement is it's the kind of smashed up junk shop of Western literature, in which Milton has absorbed what he thinks and what really is the entire extant canon of Latin and Greek literature, and a whole pile of medieval and Renaissance Italian and French literature, and a lot of English literature. And he produces an epic that says that it is the culmination and indeed the destruction of all previous tradition. This is literature to end literature. We'll talk a bit about the publication of it in a little while, but that's perhaps a brief introduction to point out to you why the stakes of literature are raised very high with this poem. I believe that Milton thought he was directly divinely inspired. It is quite complicated. He hedges it in the poem a little bit, but certainly when one reads his extremely heretical Latin theology that he kept under lock and key, we're dealing with a man who thought that God was mandating him to write like this, and that what he had to do was to justify the ways of God to men. And that was what he thought the project of his epic was.
Now, it's true that Samuel Johnson described Paradise Lost as being a perfect design, but he also said that no one had ever wished that it were any longer. I didn't know until I was researching this that he apparently intended initially the poem to be a drama. Now, curiously, 55 years ago, I dramatised part of Paradise Lost in Scotland at university with the poet Edwin Morgan doing the main narration. Yeah. But I could only dramatise part of it because it is immensely long. How did he ever envisage it being done as a drama?
It's a great question, and I'll come to it just by kind of leaping off a couple of things Will said, and then get back to that very specific question. But I think this question about, I also think that Milton believed and needs us to believe that he was that he was a divinely inspired prophet and writer. I think one thing that kind of takes us towards drama about that idea is that I think it's worth dwelling a little bit longer on what you really believe, if you believe that, because that can feed it absolutely fits in with Milton's egotism. And I always feel when I'm teaching Paradise Lost to my students, one of the challenges is getting them past that stage of saying, well, he's just an egotist. Who is this guy who thinks he has a divine, he has a kind of telephone line to God? But the interesting thing about that is when you start to really dwell on it, it's a very odd thing to consider yourself to be or to want to be. To be a prophet is simultaneously to elevate yourself, to see yourself as having been singled out and having this direct access to God that the rest, or to some kind of divine information that the rest of us don't have. But it's also, of course, to kind of erase yourself. That means that what you're saying is not what you're saying. And that's why the prophets in the Old Testament all have such a miserable time of it, because you're being, in a sense, obliterated by being singled out. So Will said earlier that Paradise Lost is dictated. And it is, again, it's just the most astonishing thing to think of that as the production of someone who couldn't see. But in a sense, right, the poem is actually doubly dictated. It is dictated by Milton's muse to him each night, and then he wakes up and frantically tries to get to kind of recite what he's woken up with in his head to his amanuensis. And so what that means is it's a very complicated combination of having a voice, of having a powerful and divinely validated voice, and on the other hand, of being a vessel for someone else's voice. So Milton's contemporary, the great political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, they had certain ways of seeing the nature of the world in common and utterly different in most ways, including their politics. Hobbes, who was very contemptuous of claims to prophetic inspiration, said, "Why would you want to be like a bagpipe for God?" That was his vision of the prophet. And that really says something about what are you asking to be? You're asking to be something that someone else's wind is getting blown through, right? And so I think, but what really fascinates me, so where I've come to with this, I think, in my own thinking about Milton over the years, is it really is both at once. I think he is and sees himself as being a poetic, a sort of craftsperson, someone with agency, someone who is shaping and fine-tuning and crafting the verse. And he is at the same time someone who is giving himself up to something, who has voices kind of happening to him. And the amazing thing reading the poetry is you get that powerful sense of Milton, the individual, that, as Will said, is incredible and unprecedented. And also a sense of voices, many voices coming from somewhere. And so this poem, Lycidas, that Will mentioned, which is the only work of Milton's that I probably love as much as I love Paradise Lost. It really is just the most incredible poem. And part of what's incredible about it, again, it's again, and you can tell a story about Milton the egotist. He's supposed to write a poem about his university friend or acquaintance who drowned. And actually what he writes is a poem about him discovering his own vocation as a poet. And you think, well, that's not a very kind thing to do, is it? I wonder what his parents made of that. Yeah. But again, when you read the poem, it's this kind of gallery of voices that leap in. You're constantly getting surprised as you're reading by a voice that kind of comes from nowhere and shocks and surprises the speaker within the poem. So again, it's this sense of control and giving up control, of having a voice and having many voices. And this is a long-winded answer to your question, but that's why I think Milton was both drawn to drama and could never be fully satisfied with it, because it answered that. I think he had some kind of inclination towards a gallery of voices, a set of voices, but it was always somehow in tension with this sense of himself as someone with a single overweening artistic ambition that he wanted to tell us about and make very clear to us. So he writes masques, sort of masques being the kind of very ceremonial and kind of high-tech forms of drama that were performed in the royal court, but also in kind of peripheral centres of sort of extended central power. He writes the most famous one which is performed at Ludlow, which is generally known by the title Comus, although it's not the title he gave it. So he writes these dramas, and again, as he did in every genre he sort of writes versions that sort of are both in the genre and kind of undoing. He's sort of undoing drama even as he writes drama. And with Paradise Lost, we have this incredible document in the Wren Library in Cambridge, which Will edited magnificently for Oxford, which has his ideas for drama, where he has lots and lots of them. Some of them, you think, thank goodness he's not the guy. Oh, have you heard that poet John Milton? Didn't he write a play about, this Anglo-Saxon king that no one cares about? I mean, he could have gone down some real blind alleys if he'd run with one of the other ideas. But then he outlines a version of what a sort of dramatic presentation of the four might look like. And he seems to have planned to call it, one of his working titles was Adam Unparadised. But you do, in the midst of that page, it is a kind of magical moment. If you look at it, you can get very high-res images of it now. If you go to the Wren Library website, you can zoom in and look at it. It's floating in the middle of all these different ideas. You see the words Paradise Lost. Yeah. And it's a kind of magical moment of sort of glimpsing. There's something about those words struck me. It took him decades to come back to them. But it is there. But again, I think it's to do with, I think there's something that draws him to drama and something unrealisable. And I'll pass to Will now, but I'll just say a sort of slightly frivolous coda to this is there's been a long history, and someone's actually written a whole book about this, there's been a long history of failed attempts to make films of Paradise Lost. People keep trying and people keep failing. The most recent version was going to have Bradley Cooper as Satan, which is quite enjoyable to imagine.
The best part.
Yeah, and as you say, but partly it's a practical thing. How do you get the whole thing into the poem? But I think it's, again, if you read Paradise Lost, there are parts of it that feel so cinematic. When we move from hell in books 1 and 2 to God's view of into chaos, watching. It's so hard to read that and not feel like we've zoomed out. There's something about his imagination that's so visual, that's so multi-perspectival, and yet it's impossible. There's something that won't make
going
that
back
translation.
to Milton's own time, the poet laureate John Dryden, who was a big admirer, approached him and asked if he could do a drama from it. And he called it an opera, and he wrote a version rhyming couplets. The frontispiece of which I think, there we are. It was never performed, but it was very popular. In fact, at the time, a lot of people preferred it. I read it recently, and that's incomprehensible to me, but nevertheless, it was popular. Now, one difficulty of putting it on, of course, was indicated by the next slide, which is how do you costume Adam and Eve? And that's an issue at the time. It may remain one today, but it was certainly an issue then. But that illustration is from the book. That's and it may be one of the reasons for the popularity of the book, because that's actually a later, more romanticised version. But you can see that there's a tendency to have a certain imagery in mind with the illustrations from Paradise Lost. The War in Heaven's represented, but there's a lot of Adam and Eve, and that's essentially what most people know of the piece.
And there may be. I mean, there's dispute about this. Will knows more about this than I do. May want to say more about it, but there are various theories about whether there are bits of Paradise Lost that are actually retained from earlier attempts to write a dramatic version. So that it's possible that he planned to begin it with Satan's speech that he delivers upon arriving in Eden. And it's very interesting that we do begin the poem with Satan. As Will said, it's such an interesting thing about the poem. He doesn't tell the story. He had so many options of how to order the story, and he chose one of the most complicated forms. We spend 2 books of the poem with Satan before we get anywhere near God or the Garden of Eden. That idea seems to have been in his mind even for a drama, and you sort of think about things like Shakespeare's Richard III, where we get a kind of charismatic villain first. So I think that probably was an influence on him in making that decision. So he's very interested in that kind of dramatic impact, but ultimately doesn't want to do it in dramatic form. So.
Yeah, just a couple of things about the drama aspect before we move on. Very interesting what you're saying about the fact that the epic may actually have fossils of earlier attempts to do things differently embedded in it. And the smoking gun here is that when a biography of Milton was written by one of those poor nephews who had been in his private academy, the nephew said, "Here is a chunk of verse that I heard in my uncle's house in the 1640s. And it's Satan's soliloquy to the sun from Book 4 of Paradise Lost. And so, and Edward, his nephew, says, which he designed for a drama at this time. So we know that some of the soliloquies, or the speeches at least, that we get in the Edenic books are probably versions of what Milton thought was going to happen when he was going to write it as a drama. What's interesting there is that when I said that he was a confident man who said he was going to write the epic that no one would forget, is that what I didn't say was that elsewhere in his writing, he tells us what it's going to be about. And in various of his Latin poems at the time, he says, I'm going to write maybe of the deeds of the English kings, by which he kind of means King Arthur and co, or something like that. It's the sort of Geoffrey of Monmouth myths, chivalric myths, the sort of stuff that he might have picked up off Spenserian writing. And so when he's a young man and he's sure he's going to write the national epic, he thinks it really will be a national epic. It's going to be about English history, English prehistory, if you like. And so that's going to be his epic contribution. With his sacred head, he thinks he's going to write a play about Adam and Eve. And so he has an epic project, which is going to be, Arthur and Knights or something like that. And he has a play project, which is going to be Bible. And at some point, somewhere in the 1640s or something, he realized that he was right about the epic, but wrong about the content. He was right about the drama, but wrong about the content. And he did a switch. And he said, that's how I will do it. The epic is going to be the sacred thing. And it's at that point, I think, he has his light bulb moment that is why this will be the epic of the English people. Because it will not just be about men on horseback, it will be to justify the ways of God to men. And in the invocations in which he turns around and speaks to the reader at the beginning of 4 patterned books in the epic, in the final one, in book 9, he turns around and slaps people who would write military epic. Tedious havoc of fabled knights in battles famed, he says. And this was precisely the kind of thing that he promised he was going to do. So it's very interesting is that he cannibalizes his own dramatic project and then comes out with an epic. Because, of course, what you do in an epic is that you have a narrator. You don't have a narrator in drama. In epic, you can start to have this plurivocality that Joe is talking about, but with a controlling figure. So you can have your cake and eat it. You've got all your different voices, but you also have a controller. And that controller can do things like say, let's describe this sort of Star Wars. This is what happened in heaven when they picked up mountains and threw them at each other and things like that, which of course you can't do in drama. And so as it were, that was where he managed to lift the epic into space opera, because he could do this through narration.
Now, I'm very conscious of the time, and the particular copy of the book that the Inn has acquired does appear to have been annotated with a view to dramatising it. But we're fortunate to have in the audience James Long, who himself is a very distinguished writer, who can tell us how he discovered the book by accident some years ago. James.
Would you like me to take my... Oh, there you are. Hi everybody. We have to go back an awfully long time for this. This is about 34 years ago, and the circumstances are extraordinary. If I hadn't run out of 6-inch nails, I would never have found it, for a start. I just ended quite a long time as a BBC reporter and correspondent, and been all over the world and investigated all kinds of things, and I decided it was time I did what I really wanted to do and start writing books. So we wound up displacing ourselves to Devon, south edge of Dartmoor, and as I say, I bought a rickety old wool mill that needed a lot of work, and I ran out of 6-inch nails. So I walked down into Ashburton, which was the nearest town, and wandered around and discovered there was an auction room there, and an auction was going on, so I wandered in. And by chance, it was crowded, there were lots of people there. I wound up crammed onto a table next to a table with a large number of cardboard boxes, and I looked at the nearest cardboard box, and there was an old vellum document at the very top of a heap of documents, and I looked at it carefully and realised it was about the mill I had just bought, and it was the settlement of a legal case in about 1710, and it was the next but one lot up. So without looking at the rest of the box, I bought it, took it home, discovered that was interesting, but the rest of them were old property deeds that were of no interest. And then right at the bottom, there was this incredibly battered book. And I got it out, quite excited, looked at it, 4th edition of Paradise Lost, and then realised it was in pieces and somebody had scrawled all over it, and put it away at the bottom of the box, and didn't really look at it again for many, many, many years. I would get it out from time to time. I discovered I could make out some of the strange writing, but not a great deal. And then came COVID. And by that time, my son and I had co-written a history book for Faber, which was 17th century history. I was much more used to the handwriting of the time. I could start to discover more about it. I was able to untangle the ownership signature and realised it was one of the Killigrews, who were patentees of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane and all kinds of other things. Realised it was probably Charles Killigrew. Started to think there was something here I needed some expert help to understand. So at that point, I sent out emails to a couple of leading UK Milton academics, glad to say they're not here today, and got no reply at all. I explained what it was, and a month went by and nothing had happened. I thought, I'll put this out further. I sent it to an expert at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, and I said to my then wife, I wonder, we'll wait 2 or 3 weeks before there's an answer. And I pressed the send button, and about a minute and a half later, I got a reply. which effectively said, what the F, what on earth, I need to know much more. And that person put me onto another person, and that other person put me onto wonderful Alan Nelson from the West Coast, who's been in this building many times. And as soon as he could, and COVID allowed, Alan jumped on an aeroplane and came over and stayed with us. And we spent many hours then and many days later on gradually trying to disentangle what this was all about. And there it is. And I have to say, although I've spent a lifetime being very curious and unearthing in various auctions and stuff, lots of strange things, this is actually not the most interesting one. It's the second most interesting one of all those things.
Thank you, James. There is an exhibition upstairs on the 4th floor in room 1, and a superb exhibition, I think, that gives some much more detail about this and explains who some of these names are and the context. Charles Killigrew was the Royal Master of Revels, an extraordinary title that I revel in. And it looks as though he was planning a production, and there are clues that indicate he was planning it here. But more research is needed, I think, is the phrase. Now, we've more than used our time, but I did say to Will and Joe I would allow questions. And I can see an arm up already. So.
If he was the greatest of
Could you hold on? We have a roving microphone.
If he was the greatest of the British poets of all time, what influence did he have on those that followed him, on Wordsworth, on Shelley, on Byron, on Keats, and all the romantic poems? Any influence at all? Because it's not immediately obvious.
Yes, I mean, we won't go on about this, but an influence so colossal as to be stultifying. And that his influence on quite a lot of 18th century literature was paralysis. The number of post-Miltonic writings that are saturated with his diction, with his moral austerity even, but particularly what we would think of his subject matter, particularly what we think of as Georgic, with nature poetry. There is a clear line between Milton writing about Eden, the 18th century writers doing Georgic, and the late 18th, early 19th century romantic writers. And so I would say that in a certain sense, actually, it was not Milton's theology and his justifying the ways of God to men that was the true current of what he pushed down into English literature, but it was really his nature writing in many ways, which is probably the thread that is strongest. But there are endless books about his influence, so much so that we now, in a certain sense, there's too much of his influence rather than not enough.
I'll just add one thing to that, which is that what I like about tracing Milton's influences and afterlives, I'm not sure if he's the greatest English poet, but he's definitely the most disagreed about English poet. He's inspired the strongest opinions of reverence and of real loathing, either for what he stood for or the way he wrote, or for his influence on other poets. T.S. Eliot famously sort of blamed him for ruining English poetry. And that, for me, is part of the excitement of tracing those afterlives. It's very interesting to look at what people said about Shakespeare at different ages. You learn a lot about Shakespeare and about the times. But it is largely, with a couple of exceptions, like Tolstoy, who hated Shakespeare, but it's largely a catalogue of admiration. Whereas Milton, you are encountering really violently opposed opinions. People who loved him, copied him, followed him, and people who hated the whole idea of doing that. So that, again, for me, sort of opens him up to difference. So sort of by seeing what different people have done with him and how they've judged him, you're actually sort of opening up the question of who he was and what he meant, rather than just seeing, oh, here's another person who sort of genuflected at the altar of his genius.
Eliot referred to the Chinese wall with Milton's verse. It was that big a construction. And that was one thing that we didn't mention about this, that we should mention now, because of Dryden and your Dryden, is that Milton didn't rhyme. He wrote unrhymed blank verse, and he did this as a revolutionary gesture. And this, in many ways, was one of the most influential things he did, was that he said, you do not need to use rhyming couplets. He said this is the invention of a modern and barbarous age. Ancient liberty and ancient ores again, would be unrhymed verse. So when Dryden wrote an opera, Dryden came to him and he said, Milton, do you mind if I just rhyme up your epic? That's what he did, and that's what he did. And poor Milton went to his grave with that injustice.
Anyone else? At the back? I'll come to you next. Sorry.
The great classical scholar Richard Bentley published an edition of Milton's work based on the theory that his amanuensis wasn't very good and that the text needed correcting and improving. Do you have any views on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is an absolute classic.
Yeah.
This is totally wonderful. It's very interesting because Bentley was always regarded as a total scandal for this. Richard Bentley, greatest living classicist, early 18th century, had made his name as an astonishingly good historicist scholar in antiquity, basically. He has a problem in many ways, which is that suddenly the English have their own vernacular epic on classical backgrounds, and they haven't had one before. And I think that Bentley, the representative of the classical tradition, was rather threatened by this. And so what he did was that he thought he would control and desecrate the phenomenon by editing it. And what he did was he said, because he was blind, we can put case that the great Milton and the great Bentley have the same poem in their minds. But there was a nasty being called the amanuensis who got in the way and produced the thing that was printed, and that the great Bentley will commune with the great Milton and restore the epic. Now, as you go through his annotations, you realise more and more that he is not actually taking pot shots at the amanuensis. The mask slips, and he starts saying things like, our author, is clearly wrong in saying this. And it becomes increasingly obvious as you handle Bentley's edition that it's a stunt. What's quite interesting is that Bentley is actually using that device of the bad copyist in his genuine classical editing at that time, particularly in the Latin poem Manilius, which is actually a very good classical tool to say that one of the ways in which we amend classical texts is that we say that there's something wrong in the copying tradition. So one of the kind of fillip of that problem about Bentley is that although Bentley gets much bashed these days for having wrecked Milton deliberately, and everyone was up in arms about it at the time, the greatest scholar trashing the greatest poet, the tools he was using were actually the emerging tools of the good classicist. And so there's a very complicated moment in early 18th century scholarship there. But yeah, Bentley's a very interesting character.
I just had a footnote while the mic's going around. I mean, I often teach Bentley's Milton. I often give bits of it to my students. And the reason I do that is because Bentley, I mean, as Will said, he's doing very strange things for very strange reasons, but he is genuinely troubled by Milton's verse. And if he's trying to fix something to make it simpler or more comprehensible or smoother or whatever it is he wants from it, the fact he wants to do that probably tells you something about what Milton actually wrote. Absolutely. So you're actually learning something from his, if he's attempting to tidy it, what was the mess?
Yeah.
Right? And that actually gets you to some really interesting places. So for all his kind of crackpot theories, there's something more useful about seeing someone kind of messing with Milton. Mm-hmm. You learn more from that, perhaps, than, again, from just someone being kind of reverent and praising him unequivocally.
2 of his readings have made it into the standard text now. So Bentley got it right twice.
I've been told we have one more question and then have to wrap up.
No, I've got 2 online as well. You see.
2 online?
Yes.
Oh, right. Well, let's have the one in the room first.
Thanks for an interesting discussion. You both said that Milton genuinely believed that he was sort of fulfilling the role of the Vatic poet and channeling this divine sort of muse-like poem from God. But then, Joe, you also mentioned that in the epic you can really tell, like, Milton's views really shine through. And as we know, he wrote many pamphlets and writings on his political opinions. So where do you think that the line is drawn between this sort of English Christian epic that he really wanted to create and a more pragmatic political role that he was also playing in that he also played in his role for the Cromwellian government?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose I might go back to the thing that Will said about the kind of control of the narrator in Paradise Lost. So the move from drama to epic means you can have I mean, the sort of famous example that comes to mind, on which a lot of this hinges, is you can have Satan giving soaring, compelling, painful, powerful speeches, but then you can have a narrator coming in and saying, "Thus spake the apostate angel, though in pain, vaunting aloud the rapid deep despair." Oh, phew, now we know what's really going on. We can be told that. But as many of you will know, one of the great critical debates about the poem is, around the thing that Blake famously said, that Milton was of the devil's party, but knew it not. Right? That's the bit that gets forgotten. Is he saying Milton kind of inadvertently finding himself in a position of sympathy with Satan? So, and the reason I talk about this in relation to your question is it raises a really interesting question about the extent to which Milton knew what he was doing. Right, that's what it really comes down to. Is whether because I suppose what's really fascinating about the question you're raising is, even if you intend to outline your political beliefs, that doesn't mean you will be successful in doing so. That doesn't mean you will not necessarily give yourself away or have underlying divided sympathies that might come through in your writing in other ways. So I think any act of writing, especially of poetic writing, is a fascinating mixture of exercising control and relinquishing control. I think that's always true with literature. And what I think for me is so fascinating about Milton is he takes those opposed impulses to an extreme. He wants control more than anyone, and he gives up control more than anyone. And that's maybe where those kind of complications come from.
No, Don,
Yeah,
two online questions?
Yeah, we have at least as many people online watching this fascinating symposium than are actually in the theatre. So, I'll take a couple of questions because it would be disrespectful of them if I don't ask at least two of them. One actually follows on, I think, quite well from what was just being said. Matt, who doesn't give us his other name, says that many people find the first book on hell completely absorbing, but heaven in book 3 a bit flat. Keith wrote that on his copy, hell is finer than this. Why do you think this is? And did Milton intend it?
I'm very happy to answer that one for a bit. There's an American critic who in the 1960s described Milton's Paradise Lost as a program of reader harassment. And it's actually a brilliant phrase by a man who then went strongly off the boil. Because he said, imagine that what this epic is trying to do is to teach the reader what the right view is about creation, about fall, and about redemption. How to get the big spiritual truths right. Now, rather than simply being didactic in telling you what to think, as it were, Milton makes you think through the problems. And so he starts the poem with the most exciting stuff, but with the narrator chiming in to tell you that you've got it wrong. So you get a great speech by Satan that's kind of 90% there, but there's a big problem. And then the narrator comes in and says, "You fool, whoosh, that was wrong, try again. Fail again, fail better." And then he does it again, and again, and again. And then after we've had 2 of the books like that, Milton then moves you to a totally different realm where the people will not be wrong. They now speak using a very different kind of syntax. There's been very interesting analysis of the language. We love Satan's language because it is extremely kind of implicated with lots of subclauses and difficult words, and it would make sort of people drawing language of lines of syntax very excited. When we get to heaven, suddenly everything is just straight in a line. The angels speak very kind of one thing after another, very logically. So does God. Milton is harassing us again to say that this discourse is better. He then will go into change genre again. He will go into battle poetry, and he will allow you to think that you're getting it right, but then he will say you're wrong. Battle poetry is a waste of time. He then gives you creation epic. He then gives you fall. In other words, the poem moves through a lot of different genres, and it kind of tries to educate the reader as it goes about how you should best appraise what is going on. And indeed, it may be that the most pleasurable poetry is not the best poetry in a moral sense. That leaves us with a colossal aesthetic paradox, that Milton may also be saying that some of the best writing here is some of the worst thinking. But it's incumbent upon you as a reader to understand this. So that is why many people find it a very hard poem and give up after 2 books, because he front loads it with the naughty stuff.
The second question from Liam Binney is actually about the marginalia, and I don't think we've really got time to deal with that, and I don't think that our speakers have had the opportunity really to examine the marginalia sufficiently closely to be able to comment on it. So I'm not going to ask it, and I hope you'll forgive me. It's a very interesting question, but I don't think at the moment we're in a position to answer it.
Joe, you could have a crack.
We've had some time.
Okay.
We have some ideas.
With caveats and qualifications, we might be able to say something.
Is there any marginalia that surrounds the illustrations to each book, which would indicate that they were using text and images together to adapt the poem?
No. The illustrations have been removed from the book. James tells me long before he caught sight of it. I imagine they were regarded as valuable.
Yes.
And they've been
Possibly
abstracted
never
from the book.
It may have been proof copy, it's been suggested as well. We don't know.
Well, I suspect they were just cut out and put on the wall. I mean, that's the fate
Yeah.
of most of full-page engravings in late 17th century books, is that they're early forms of posters.
Yes, indeed.
Well, a very good question, and thank you very much for asking it, Liam. That's it. But before we move on, and before I move to what will be a very sincere vote of thanks to our 3 panelists, can I mention something, which is this, that it will become apparent to everybody that this volume is an extremely important volume in terms of the history of Milton, in terms of the history of the inn, in terms of the history of English literature. And at the moment, you will see from the various illustrations that it is in very poor condition. The illustrations, as you've heard, have been taken out, and there is much of it that needs serious conservation. The book is itself, with the marginalia, is one of a kind, and it is vital that before work is done on it, and there is a lot of work to be done on it, to interpret it, to understand it better, to see what the significance of everything is, before that's done, we really do need to conserve it properly. Now, the book was actually bought by private subscription from by a number of benchers of the inn, and given to the inn, but the inn itself doesn't have the means available to it because to carry out this conservation work. It's actually outside its core function, and so a further appeal has to be made to ensure that it is conserved correctly. We would be very grateful if you give some thought to whether you could make a modest contribution. Apparently, £25 a page would be a reasonable way of looking at it, but in all, some £6,000 is needed. Can I encourage you to think that this is something well worth doing? And there is a link to the inn's website, and there are cards with the quick access to the website which are available. If you're outside and having a drink, particularly if you're having your second drink, please take a card, and tomorrow morning, perhaps, think of making a relatively modest contribution, which would make an important difference to the capacity to save for posterity this extremely important work. So,
might I suggest that you ask the National Lottery Heritage Fund if they're interested in making any contribution?
thank you very much.
If it's that important.
Right? Yeah, we will keep that in mind. It is very important. So, then the thank yous. I won't take up too much time because it will simply embarrass people. But I said at the start of this that we had two of the leading experts on Milton and on Paradise Lost. Over the last hour and 20 minutes, I'm quite sure they've totally convinced you that what I said was totally right. The depth of knowledge which we've had from our invited speakers has been breathtaking and has held us all riveted for much longer than we'd expected.
It's a euphemism.
So his fault there.
I'm extraordinarily grateful to them for coming. And I should say thank you also to our own homegrown star, Tom Kinninmont, who, as you can see, had done a fair amount of work and research in order to be able to do a sort of Melvin Bragg operation on this, and to move the conversation on at appropriate speed with chipping in his own knowledge on the subject, which is clearly extensive as well. So for the three of you, a most sincere thank you, and I'm sure everyone would want to express their appreciation. Oh, finally, let me just say, 11th of November, at the Middle Temple, the Salted Society and Four Inns annual lecture will be given by Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, and will be on judges as historians. I gather that he is actually questioning some of the fundamental work in the standard textbooks on public international law, and only he could do it with the sort of force that he can bring to the subject. And then our next talk will be given by Professor Baker in the spring, but you'll hear about that in due course. It's basically on the history of the legal profession, and will be, I'm sure, a tour d'horizon, which we will all benefit from. Thank you all. There's wine out there. Please help yourselves.